The seat that wasn't meant to be. Ethan Carter adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase as he stepped into the bustling Atlanta airport. A rising tech entrepreneur in his early 30s, Ethan had worked tirelessly over the past year to secure a game-changing contract in New York City. This flight was supposed to be the start of a new chapter, a prelude to success. The airport was its usual cacophony of hurried footsteps, muted announcements, and the faint hum of distant jet engines. Ethan liked to arrive early for flights, his meticulous nature never allowing for last-minute scrambles. He checked his boarding pass for the 10th time as he approached the gate. Flight 872 to New York, seat 14C. At the gate, he joined the line of passengers boarding the plane. A middle-aged woman in front of him fumbled with her purse, and Ethan instinctively reached out to help her. She smiled, thanked him, and muttered something about being late. He laughed politely, trying to brush off his nervous energy. This trip meant everything. The plane smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee as he stepped aboard. Flight attendants in neatly pressed uniforms greeted passengers with smiles, guiding them to their seats. Ethan found his assigned spot, an aisle seat in the middle of the economy section. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, slid into his seat, and exhaled deeply. Finally, he muttered, pulling out his laptop to review the presentation that could seal his future. Passengers continued to shuffle down the narrow aisle. Some were chatty, others silent. A toddler's cries pierced the air, prompting collective sighs from those seated nearby. Ethan glanced at his watch. They were nearly ready for takeoff. "Excuse me, sir," the voice, clipped and authoritative, jolted Ethan out of his focus. He looked up to see a flight attendant standing before him. Her name tag read K. Rowe. She appeared calm but distant, her expression more perfunctory than friendly. "Yes," Ethan replied, sitting up straight. "May I see your boarding pass?" she asked, a tight smile on her face. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but handed over his pass. Rowe glanced at it briefly before handing it back. "There's been a change. You'll need to move to another seat." Ethan frowned. "I don't understand. My ticket is for 14C. Is there an issue?" She didn't answer immediately, instead gesturing toward the rear of the plane. "You've been reassigned. Please collect your belongings and move to the back. We need this seat for operational reasons." Passengers around them started to murmur, their eyes darting between Ethan and the attendant. The words "operational reasons" felt vague and insincere, but Ethan bit his tongue. He traveled enough to know it wasn't worth making a scene over seat arrangements. "Fine," he said curtly, grabbing his laptop and briefcase. He stood and stepped into the aisle, feeling the weight of strangers' gazes on him as he made his way toward the back of the plane. Rowe followed closely behind. When he reached the rear section, Rowe pointed to a window seat near the galley. It was smaller, cramped, and next to a man already fast asleep with his head tilted back and mouth open. Ethan squeezed into the seat, muttering under his breath. He had no idea what operational reasons meant, but he was determined not to let this ruin his trip. Minutes passed, and the boarding process wrapped up. Ethan noticed that seat 14C, the one he had been forced to vacate, remained empty as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. His frustration grew, but he tried to push it aside. The plane taxied onto the runway, its engines roaring to life. As the wheels lifted off the ground, Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes, focusing on the opportunities awaiting him in New York. Little did he know, this flight was about to unravel in ways he could never have anticipated. The turbulence started about 20 minutes into the flight. It wasn't unusual, but it made the already claustrophobic seat feel worse. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, noticing a faint commotion further up the aisle. Two passengers were speaking in hushed tones to another flight attendant. Something felt off, though Ethan couldn't pinpoint what. The murmurs escalated into a loud exchange. A tall man, visibly agitated, was gesturing emphatically as the flight attendant tried to calm him. Ethan craned his neck to see what was happening, but his view was obstructed. Whatever the issue, It wasn't subsiding. Soon, the lead flight attendant, the same key row who had reassigned Ethan's seat, walked briskly down the aisle. She stopped just short of the commotion and exchanged a few words with her colleague before addressing the disgruntled passenger. Her tone was clipped and commanding. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat immediately." The man crossed his arms. "I'm not going anywhere until I get an explanation," he replied, his voice loud enough for most of the cabin to hear. Passengers whispered to one another, their curiosity piqued. Ethan noticed that Rose's demeanor seemed less composed than before. She glanced toward the cockpit before addressing the man again. "If you do not comply, we'll have no choice but to involve security when we land," she said, her tone firmer now. The man threw up his hands in exasperation. "Fine, but you can bet this isn't the last you'll hear about it." He stomped back to his seat, and Rose quickly retreated to the galley area. Ethan could see the tension in her posture as she whispered to another crew member. Something wasn't adding up. The flight continued without further incident. For a while, passengers settled into their routines, some watching movies, others napping. Ethan tried to focus on his presentation again, but his unease lingered. The strange reassignment of his seat and the mid-flight confrontation gnawed at him. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened as we prepare for descent." A ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, and several began questioning the flight attendants. Ethan's instincts told him that whatever was happening, it wasn't routine. When the plane finally touched down in Charlotte, the tension was palpable. No one had been given an explanation, and the cabin crew remained tight-lipped. As the plane taxied to a remote part of the tarmac, Ethan's curiosity turned to unease. Suddenly, 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded the plane. They walked briskly to the front of the cabin, where they paused, scanning the rows. Then, to Ethan's shock, one of them pointed directly at him. "Mr. Carter," the officer said firmly, "we need you to come with us." The quiet storm. Ethan's heart pounded as the security officer called his name. The cabin grew eerily silent as passengers turned in their seats, their curiosity palpable. Ethan's mind raced, searching for an explanation. He hadn't caused a disturbance. He hadn't even spoken to anyone since he was reassigned his seat. Why was he being singled out? "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. Years of running a business had taught him to keep his composure under pressure. "Mr. Carter, we'll explain everything once we're off the plane," the officer replied curtly. His tone left no room for negotiation. Passengers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Ethan and the officers. Embarrassment burned in Ethan's chest as he stood and reached for his briefcase. The aisle felt impossibly long as he followed the officers toward the front of the plane. He caught a glimpse of the lead flight attendant, Kay Rowe, who avoided his gaze, her expression unreadable. The moment Ethan stepped onto the tarmac, the heavy air of the North Carolina summer hit him like a wall. The plane loomed behind him, its engines quieting as ground crew moved into position. Ethan turned to the officers, his confusion giving way to frustration. "Are you going to tell me what's going on now?" he asked, his voice sharper than before. The taller of the 2 officers, a man with a salt and pepper beard, cleared his throat. "We were informed by the crew that there was a passenger who posed a potential security threat." Ethan froze. A security threat. The words echoed in his mind, absurd and offensive. "That's ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't done anything. I've been sitting in my seat the entire time." "We're just following protocol," the officer said. "You'll have a chance to explain your side." "My side? There is no side. I've done nothing wrong." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "I want to speak to someone in charge." The officers exchanged a glance before the taller one gestured toward the terminal. "You can file a formal complaint with the airline." For now, we need to escort you to the airport security office." Ethan clenched his fists, knowing there was little he could do in the moment. He followed the officers across the tarmac, his mind a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. The terminal confrontation. Inside the terminal, the security office was stark and utilitarian, with beige walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. Ethan was led to a small room where a plainclothes security officer sat behind a desk, reviewing paperwork. The officer gestured for Ethan to sit. "Mr. Carter, I'm Officer Daniels," he began, setting the papers aside. "We've received a report from the flight crew that you refused to comply with instructions and exhibited erratic behavior." Ethan stared at Daniels, stunned. "That's completely false," he said firmly. "I was reassigned to a different seat without explanation. I didn't argue. I didn't cause a scene. I don't know where this is coming from." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "So you're denying the crew's report?" "Absolutely. Whoever reported this is lying," Ethan said, leaning forward. "If you check with other passengers, you'll see that I've been sitting quietly since I boarded." Daniels hesitated, then sighed. "Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration, but we take all reports of potential security threats seriously. Until we can verify the details, you won't be allowed to reboard your flight." Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him. "You can't be serious. I have a critical meeting in New York tomorrow morning." "This is insane." Daniels spread his hands apologetically. "The airline has the final say on who is permitted to fly on their aircraft." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak with someone from the airline." Daniels nodded and picked up the phone, speaking briefly with someone on the other end. After a tense few minutes, a representative from the airline arrived. A young man in a crisp navy suit who introduced himself as Greg Matthews. "Mr. Carter," Greg began, "I'm here to address your concerns. I understand this has been an upsetting experience." "Upsetting," Ethan said, his voice rising. "I've been falsely accused of being a security threat, removed from my flight without explanation, and now you're barring me from traveling. I want to know why." Greg held up his hands defensively. "The flight crew reported a situation that required action. As per protocol, we always prioritize safety." "Safety. This has nothing to do with safety," Ethan shot back. "This is about profiling and mistreatment. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." Greg's face remained neutral. "I assure you, we're conducting an internal investigation into the matter. In the meantime, we'd like to offer you a hotel voucher and a rebooking on a later flight." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "A hotel voucher? That's your solution? No apology, no explanation. Just sweep this under the rug and hope I go away." Greg's composure faltered. "Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration." "No, you don't," Ethan interrupted. "This isn't just about me. How often does this happen to people who can't fight back? How many passengers have been treated like this and forced to stay silent?" Greg said nothing, his silence confirming what Ethan already suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic. The power of exposure. As Ethan left the security office, his anger gave way to resolve. He wasn't going to let the airline get away with this. He found a quiet corner of the terminal and pulled out his phone. After a deep breath, he opened his social media app and began typing. "Removed from Flight 872 for no reason. Falsely accused of being a security threat. This feels like blatant profiling. At airline name, I demand accountability. #discrimination, #unjust treatment." He hit post and watched as the tweet went live. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with notifications. Comments and retweets poured in, some expressing outrage, others sharing similar experiences. The #unjust treatment began to trend. Ethan wasn't just venting, he was building momentum. He knew the power of social media and the internet's ability to amplify injustice. If the airline thought they could silence him, They were sorely mistaken. By the time he reached the hotel, his tweet had gone viral. News outlets had picked up the story, and reporters were reaching out for interviews. Ethan gave brief statements, recounting his experience and emphasizing the broader implications. "This isn't just about me," he told one journalist. "It's about a system that allows corporations to mistreat paying customers without consequence. This has to stop." The first crack. The next morning, as Ethan prepared to meet with his lawyer, he received a direct message from someone claiming to be a former employee of the airline. The message was brief but loaded with implications. "They'd done this before. You're not the first. Contact me. I have proof." Ethan's pulse quickened. Proof. If this person was legitimate, they could blow the lid off something much bigger than his own incident. He replied immediately, arranging a phone call later that day. When the call came, the voice on the other end was cautious but resolute. "My name's Brian. I worked for the airline for 8 years. I quit 2 months ago because I couldn't be part of it anymore." "Part of what?" Ethan asked, already suspecting the answer. "The profiling," Brian said. "They have unwritten rules about who to watch, who to flag. It's subtle, but it's there. And it's always the same type of people who get targeted." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He listened as Brian detailed internal policies and incidents that mirrored his own experience. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a culture. "I have documents," Brian said. "Emails, training materials. If you're serious about exposing them, I'll send them to you." "I'm serious," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Send everything." As he ended the call, Ethan realized he was no longer just fighting for himself. This was about holding an entire system accountable. The whistleblower's file. Ethan couldn't sit still. He paced his hotel room, phone in hand, anxiously waiting for the promised documents. The call with Brian had ignited something in him, a determination to not only fight back, but to uncover the truth. When the email notification finally popped up on his screen, he felt both relief and a surge of adrenaline. The subject line read, "Airline profiling documents. Confidential." Ethan opened the email and scanned its contents. Attached were several PDF files, each labeled with nondescript names like Training Manual 2019 and Incident Reports Key 3. He downloaded them to his laptop and sat down at the small desk, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the first file. The unveiling. The first document appeared to be a section from a training manual. It detailed vague protocols about passenger behavior monitoring. But as Ethan read on, the language became increasingly troubling. Phrases like heightened vigilance for noncompliance and additional screening for passengers exhibiting atypical behavior stood out. The examples given in the manual, paired with descriptions of risk profiles, were thinly veiled attempts to normalize racial and cultural profiling. Ethan's stomach turned. It wasn't overt, but it was clear enough. The airline was training its employees to treat certain passengers as threats based on superficial criteria. He moved on to the second file, labeled Incident Reports. This one was worse. It contained summaries of complaints filed by passengers who had been removed from flights or subjected to additional scrutiny. Many of the names and details were redacted, but patterns emerged. Words like non-compliance, suspicious, and uncooperative appeared frequently, often tied to passengers with traditionally ethnic names or who identified as people of color. The most damning part, however, was the follow-up section. In nearly every case, the complaints were marked as resolved, passenger rebooked, or resolved, passenger compensation. The airline had made a habit of silencing these incidents with quick settlements, ensuring no larger investigation ever surfaced. Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of outrage and disbelief. He hadn't just stumbled into a personal injustice. He had uncovered a systemic problem. This wasn't about one flight or one crew. This was a company culture carefully designed to avoid accountability while perpetuating discrimination. Assembling the pieces. Over the next several hours, Ethan combed through every document Brian had sent. He printed out key sections, highlighting incriminating phrases and making notes in the margins. When he finished, his desk was littered with papers, his laptop surrounded by coffee cups and empty water bottles. His next move was clear. He needed to speak with Brian again. Ethan called him immediately, and this time, the voice on the other end of the line sounded more confident. "Did you see the reports?" Brian asked. "I did," Ethan replied. "This isn't just profiling. This is a systematic cover-up. They'd been silencing people for years." "That's exactly why I left," Brian said. "I couldn't keep working for a company that treated people like that. The worst part is, it's not just the passengers. They train flight attendants to enforce these policies without question, and anyone who pushes back risks their job." Ethan thought of the lead flight attendant, Kay Rowe. Her cold demeanor had felt calculated, but was it possible she'd been following orders she couldn't refuse? "Brian," Ethan said, "if I bring this to light, I need to know you're willing to go public. Your testimony could make all the difference." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'll think about it," Brian said finally. "But if I do, we need to do it right. The airline's legal team is no joke. They'll come after both of us." "I understand," Ethan said, "but I'm not backing down. If you're willing to stand with me, we can expose this for what it is." The lawyer's strategy. The next morning, Ethan met with his lawyer, Ann Castillo, in her downtown office. Ann, a sharp-eyed woman with years of experience in civil rights litigation, had been following Ethan's case closely. When he laid out the documents on her desk, she leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she read. "This is bad," Ann said, her voice low. "Very bad. For them. They've been covering this up for years," Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We can't let them get away with it." Ann nodded. "This changes everything. With these documents and Brian's testimony, we have enough to build a class action lawsuit. The key is making this public in a way they can't spin. If we control the narrative, they'll be forced to play defense." Ethan leaned back, a grim smile on his face. "What's the plan?" Ann outlined a strategy that was equal parts legal precision and media savvy. First, they would file the lawsuit, ensuring the documents became part of the public record. Next, they would coordinate a press conference, inviting journalists and advocates to highlight the broader implications of the airline's actions. Finally, they would reach out to other passengers who had experienced similar treatment, building a coalition of voices that couldn't be ignored. "This won't be easy," Ann warned. "The airline will come at us with everything they've got. But if we stick to the facts, we have a real chance to change things." Brian's decision. Later that evening, Ethan received a call from Brian. He sounded resolute. "I'll do it," Brian said. "I'll testify. But I need to remain anonymous for now. I can't risk them coming after me before we go public." Ethan felt a surge of relief. "You have my word. Ann and I will handle everything. Your safety comes first." Over the next few days, Brian provided additional context and documentation, strengthening the case. Ann filed the lawsuit, and the media was notified. The press conference was scheduled for the following week, and Ethan braced himself for the storm that was sure to follow. The airline's counterattack. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly. Social media erupted, with Ethan's name trending alongside hashtags like #AirlineAccountability and #DiscriminationExpose. Support poured in from civil rights organizations, passengers, and even former employees of the airline. Ethan's story had become a rallying cry. But the airline wasn't going down without a fight. They issued a carefully crafted statement, denying the allegations and claiming they were deeply committed to diversity and inclusion. They also began a subtle campaign to discredit Ethan, suggesting he was exaggerating his experience for personal gain. Ann was prepared for this. "They'll try to make you the villain," she warned Ethan. "Don't let them rattle you. The documents speak for themselves." Despite the airline's attempts to muddy the waters, the momentum was on Ethan's side. Journalists began uncovering additional stories, many of which mirrored Ethan's experience. The tide was turning. The press conference. The day of the press conference arrived, and the room was packed with reporters, cameras, and supporters. Ethan stood at the podium, flanked by Anne, and a small group of The storm breaks. The day after the press conference, the world seemed to shift. Ethan woke up to a flood of notifications on his phone, articles, interviews, and countless messages of support. But there were also the trolls, the skeptics, and the detractors, all doing their best to undermine his credibility. The airline's legal team had begun its counteroffensive, and Ethan knew the battle was about to get much more intense. Anne called him early that morning. "They're moving quickly," she said. "I just got word they're filing a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. It's a scare tactic, but we need to be prepared." Ethan rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping in. What's their angle? They'll claim the evidence is circumstantial, that the whistleblower's testimony is unreliable, and that the training materials were misinterpreted. Classic corporate playbook, Anne replied. "But don't worry. We have enough to push forward." Ethan nodded, her confidence giving him some reassurance. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the airline wasn't just trying to win in court. They were trying to wear him down. The anonymous source. That afternoon, Ethan received another unexpected email, this time from an anonymous address. The subject line simply read, "More proof." Attached were 2 scanned documents. The first was an internal memo from the airline's leadership, dated 5 years earlier. It outlined a strategy for managing high-risk passengers, using language that barely masked its discriminatory undertones. Phrases like appearance-based profiling and proactive removal jumped out at him. The second document was even more shocking. It was a spreadsheet of flagged passengers from a single quarter, detailing reasons for their removal or additional screening. Many of the notes read like coded racism, uncooperative demeanor, doesn't fit passenger profile, and potential disruptive element. Over 80% of the flagged passengers had names that indicated they were people of color. Ethan immediately forwarded the documents to Anne. She called him minutes later, her voice taut with urgency. "These are a game changer. If these are authenticated, they could prove a deliberate pattern of discrimination." "Who sent them?" Ethan asked. "No idea," Anne said. "But if someone on the inside is still leaking, it means they want this to come out." The airline strikes back. 2 days later, the airline launched its full-scale media assault. High-ranking executives appeared on national news, vehemently denying the allegations. The CEO himself gave a live interview, painting the airline as a victim of a smear campaign. "We are a company built on inclusivity," the CEO said, his polished demeanor exuding confidence. "These claims are baseless and harmful, not just to our employees, but to the millions of passengers who trust us every year." Ethan watched the interview from his hotel room, seething. The audacity of their denial, even in the face of mounting evidence, felt like a slap in the face. The airline wasn't just defending itself, it was doubling down. Within hours, social media was ablaze. Hashtags like #AirlineLease and #JusticeForThan trended alongside #SupportOurCrew, a hashtag clearly orchestrated by the airline's PR team. The battle lines were drawn, a rallying cry. Determined to keep the momentum on their side, Ethan and Anne organized a second press event, this time featuring a panel of affected passengers and advocates. They wanted to make it clear that this wasn't just about one man. It was about a pattern of systemic injustice. The event was held in a packed community center in Atlanta, with cameras from major networks lining the back of the room. Ethan sat beside a diverse group of people, each with their own story of mistreatment by the airline. A woman named Maria shared how she and her 3 children were removed from a flight because a passenger felt uncomfortable with her speaking Spanish. An older man named Ahmed recounted being pulled aside for questioning every time he flew, despite never causing a problem. A young woman named Tanya described being escorted off a plane after a flight attendant claimed she looked suspicious. The stories were gut-wrenching, each one reinforcing the pervasive nature of the problem. By the time Ethan stood to speak, her room was heavy with emotion. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice steady but charged with conviction. "This is about all of us. About a system that's been allowed to discriminate, intimidate, and silence people for far too long. Today, we're saying no more. We're standing up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's been mistreated and ignored. And we won't stop until there's real accountability." The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan felt a surge of energy. This was bigger than him now. It was a movement. A corporate whistleblower. Later that evening, another unexpected twist came. A high-level executive from the airline contacted Anne's office, offering to provide insider testimony. The executive, who requested anonymity, claimed to have direct knowledge of the company's discriminatory practices. Ethan and Anne met with the executive in a secure location. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of authority. Her name was Eleanor. "I've been with the company for 15 years, Eleanor began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "When I started, I believed in its mission. But over time, I saw things I couldn't ignore." She detailed how the airline's leadership had implemented policies that encouraged profiling under the guise of safety measures. She described meetings where executives openly discussed how to minimize complaints and avoid lawsuits, often by offering quiet settlements. "They've been doing this for years," Eleanor said. "They don't see it as discrimination. They see it as protecting the brand. But make no mistake, they know exactly what they're doing." Eleanor provided additional documents to support her claims, including meeting notes and emails from senior executives. It was a goldmine of evidence, and Ethan could see Anne's mind already working on how to use it in court. "Why are you coming forward now?" Ethan asked. Eleanor looked him in the eye. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because someone finally had the courage to stand up to them. You inspired me." The turning point. With Eleanor's testimony and the newly leaked documents, Anne revised their legal strategy. They now had enough to not only fight the airline's motion to dismiss, but to press for a full federal investigation. The court filings became public, and the media pounced on the story. Headlines like "Airline Exec Confirms Systemic Profiling" and "Explosive Evidence in Discrimination Lawsuit" dominated the news cycle. Public opinion shifted further against the airline, and calls for boycotts grew louder. The airline's legal teams scrambled to respond, but the cracks in their facade were growing. Investors began pulling out, and whispers of a shareholder revolt made their way to the press. For the first time, Ethan felt like the tide was truly turning. The calm before the trial. As the trial date approached, Ethan prepared himself for the fight of his life. The stakes were enormous, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered under the airline's discriminatory practices. He spent hours with Anne and the legal team, rehearsing his testimony, reviewing the evidence, and anticipating the airline's counterarguments. But even in the midst of the chaos, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. He had started this journey as a single passenger wronged by a system, but now he was part of something much larger, a fight for justice, accountability, and change. As he stood in the courtroom on the first day of the trial, facing the airline's high-powered legal team, he felt a wave of resolve wash over him. This was it. The storm had broken, and now it was time to see it through. The courtroom battle. The courtroom was a hive of tension, its atmosphere crackling with anticipation. Lawyers in tailored suits shuffled papers and whispered in hushed tones, while the gallery filled with reporters, activists, and spectators eager to witness what had become one of the most publicized legal battles in recent memory. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him. To his left, Anne Castillo methodically arranged her notes, her confidence radiating like a steady flame. Across the room, the airline's legal team, an army of sharp-eyed attorneys in expensive suits, prepared to unleash their carefully crafted defense. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. Ethan's heart pounded as everyone rose, then sat again. This was it, the moment that would determine whether his fight for justice would be heard in its entirety or dismissed as an overreach. The opening arguments. Anne was the first to address the court. She stood tall, her voice clear and deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, "this case is not just about one man's mistreatment. It is about a pattern of discriminatory practices that have been allowed to fester within this airline's culture for years. We will show evidence, emails, training manuals, testimonies from whistleblowers and passengers, that proves this company has systematically profiled and marginalized people based on their race, ethnicity, and appearance." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This isn't just negligence, it's intentional. And it must stop. The airline's lead attorney, Richard Grayson, rose next. He was polished and charismatic, exuding an air of authority. His strategy was clear from the outset. Paint Ethan's case as an isolated incident blown out of proportion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we have here is a misunderstanding. A single unfortunate event that has been distorted into a baseless attack on an entire corporation. My client deeply regrets any discomfort Mr. Carter may have experienced, but we will show that these allegations of systemic discrimination are not supported by the facts." Ethan clenched his fists under the table. Grayson's tone was calm, almost condescending, as though Ethan's ordeal was a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering injustice. The whistleblower testifies. The first few days of the trial were a battle of evidence. Anne meticulously presented the training manuals and incident reports Ethan had obtained, drawing clear connections between the airline's policies and its discriminatory practices. The airline's lawyers countered with technicalities, questioning the authenticity of the documents and the interpretation of their language. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Brian, the whistleblower, took the stand. Dressed modestly and with a nervous energy, Brian recounted his years at the airline, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "I was part of the team that developed these policies," he said, looking directly at the jury. "We were told to identify high-risk passengers, but the criteria we used disproportionately targeted people of color. It wasn't written in the manuals, but it was understood. We all knew what it meant." Grayson rose for cross-examination, his demeanor predatory. "Mr. Daniels," he said, addressing Brian by his last name, "isn't it true that you were terminated from the airline for poor performance?" Brian stiffened. "I resigned." "After receiving a warning about your performance, correct?" Grayson pressed, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes, but that has nothing to do with—" Grayson cut him off. "And isn't it also true that you have no direct evidence tying senior executives to these so-called discriminatory practices?" Brian faltered, but Anne objected. "Your Honor, the witness has provided documentation directly linking senior management to these practices." The judge allowed Brian to explain, and he did so with a quiet determination that resonated with the jury. Despite Grayson's attempts to discredit him, Brian's testimony painted a damning picture of the airline's internal culture. Eleanor's revelation. If Brian's testimony was the foundation, Eleanor's was the wrecking ball. When the former executive took the stand, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Eleanor spoke with the authority of someone who had been in the room where decisions were made. She detailed meetings in which senior executives discussed strategies to minimize public backlash while continuing to implement racially biased policies. "There were times," she said, "when we'd receive complaints from passengers who felt targeted, and instead of addressing the root cause, we were instructed to offer them vouchers or refunds to make the problem go away. It was all about protecting the company's image." Anne guided Eleanor through her testimony, presenting emails and meeting notes that corroborated her claims. One email, in particular, drew audible gasps from the gallery. In it, a senior executive had written, "We need to ensure high-risk passengers don't disrupt the experience for others. Handle them quietly." Grayson attempted to undermine Eleanor's credibility, but she remained unshaken. "I came forward because it's the right thing to do," she said firmly. "This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability." Ethan takes the stand. When it was Ethan's turn to testify, he felt the weight of every passenger who had shared their story with him. He spoke about the humiliation of being singled out, the confusion of being labeled a security threat without explanation, and the determination that had driven him to fight back. "I'm not here for a payout," Ethan said, looking directly at the jury. "I'm here because what happened to me is happening to others. And if we don't hold this company accountable, it will keep happening." Grayson's cross-examination was relentless. He tried to paint Ethan as a disgruntled passenger seeking attention, but Ethan held his ground. "This isn't about me," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "This is about the truth." The airline's defense. The airline's defense hinged on minimizing the evidence and discrediting the plaintiffs. They called their own employees to the stand, each of whom testified that the company's policies were designed solely to ensure safety and efficiency. But Anne was prepared. During cross-examination, she exposed inconsistencies in their testimonies, showing how the policies disproportionately impacted passengers of color. One particularly damning moment came when a flight attendant admitted, under pressure, that she had been instructed to keep an eye on passengers who fit certain profiles. The closing arguments. Anne's closing argument was a masterclass in advocacy. She wove together the testimonies, the documents, and the broader implications of the case into a compelling narrative. "This isn't just about one airline," she said. "It's about a system that allows corporations to discriminate without consequence. Today, we have a chance to change that. To say that no one, no matter their race, ethnicity, or appearance, should ever feel unwelcome in this country." Grayson's closing argument, by contrast, focused on doubt. "The plaintiffs have presented a story, not facts," he said. "A story designed to elicit sympathy, not justice." The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 tense days. When they returned, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreman said. "The airline is guilty of systemic discrimination." The gallery erupted in cheers, and Ethan felt a wave of relief and vindication. But as the judge outlined the penalties, a combination of damages and mandated policy reforms, Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. This was a victory, but it was only the beginning of a larger movement. The movement that followed. The courtroom buzzed with electricity as the verdict sank in. Reporters raced to type out breaking news headlines. Activists cheered, and supporters embraced one another. But for Ethan, the moment was quieter. A mix of relief, triumph, and the weight of what came next. He had won, but he knew this was more than a personal victory. It was a spark in a much larger fire. As Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, the bright flashes of cameras blinded him momentarily. The crowd outside roared as he appeared, chanting his name and waving signs that read, "Justice won, and accountability now." Ethan raised a hand, acknowledging the support. Beside him, Anne stood with the quiet satisfaction of a fighter who had landed the decisive blow. A reporter thrust a microphone toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter, what does this verdict mean to you?" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about every person who's been mistreated, profiled, or silenced. Today, the system was held accountable. But this is only the beginning. Change doesn't stop with one court case." The airline's reaction. The airline's leadership scrambled to respond to the fallout. Within hours of the verdict, the company issued a statement, promising to review its policies and commit to fostering a more inclusive culture. But the damage had already been done. The public saw through the platitudes, and the demand for meaningful reform grew louder. Shareholders called for the resignation of the CEO and several senior executives. The airline's stock continued to plummet, and boycotts organized by civil rights groups gained traction. The pressure reached a breaking point when an independent audit revealed additional discriminatory practices that had not been addressed during the trial. The airline, once a titan of the industry, was now fighting for its survival. The faces of change. Ethan quickly became a prominent figure in the movement for corporate accountability. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, universities, and advocacy events. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his forte, and he didn't want to be seen as capitalizing on his victory. But Anne convinced him that his voice was essential. "People look to you because you've lived it," she said. "You're not just a face on a screen. You fought this battle and won. That's powerful." Ethan agreed, but he insisted that others be included in the conversation. At every event, he brought along other passengers and whistleblowers who had shared their stories during the trial. Maria, Ahmed, Tanya, and Eleanor stood beside him on stages, their voices amplified by the platform Ethan's case had created. "Change isn't about one person," Ethan said during his first keynote address. "It's about a collective effort. It's about holding systems accountable, not just for what they've done, but for what they'll do in the future." The legislative push. The trial's outcome galvanized lawmakers who saw an opportunity to address broader issues within the airline industry. Ethan was invited to testify before Congress, where he shared his story alongside others who had experienced similar mistreatment. The hearings were emotional and raw, with lawmakers grilling airline executives about their practices. One congresswoman, visibly moved by Ethan's testimony, announced plans to introduce the Passenger Protections and Accountability Act. The proposed legislation aimed to create stricter regulations for airlines, including transparency in passenger removal policies, mandatory training to prevent bias, and harsher penalties for discriminatory practices. Ethan became a vocal advocate for the bill, rallying public support through social media and interviews. "Legislation is the next step," he told a national news anchor. "Court cases can set precedents, but laws create lasting change." The bill passed 6 months later, marking a significant victory for the movement Ethan had helped ignite. Corporate accountability goes global. The ripple effects of Ethan's case extended beyond the United States. Advocacy groups in Europe, Asia, and Africa began investigating similar practices within their airlines. Reports of racial profiling, unequal treatment, and opaque policies surfaced across the globe. Ethan was invited to collaborate with international organizations, sharing his experiences and strategies for holding corporations accountable. His case became a template for how individuals could take on powerful institutions and win. The airline's reckoning. For the airline at the center of the controversy, the consequences were severe. The CEO and several top executives were forced to resign. The company agreed to a multi-million-dollar settlement with other passengers who had joined the class action lawsuit, and it implemented sweeping reforms to its policies and training programs. Ethan, however, remained skeptical. "Apologies are easy," he said during an interview. "Real accountability takes time. We'll be watching to make sure they follow through." The airline's competitors, wary of facing similar scrutiny, preemptively began reviewing their own practices. Industry-wide changes took root, driven by the fear of becoming the next cautionary tale. Ethan's legacy. Years later, Ethan's fight remained a symbol of resilience and justice. His case was taught in law schools as a landmark in corporate accountability, and his work with advocacy groups continued to drive meaningful change. But for Ethan, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him with their own stories. Passengers who had felt powerless now felt emboldened to speak up. Whistleblowers who had feared retaliation found the courage to come forward. One day, after a speaking engagement, a young man approached Ethan. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "I went through something similar, and seeing you fight back made me feel like I could too." Ethan smiled, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "That's what this is all about," he said. "No one should have to fight alone." A new beginning. On the anniversary of the trial's verdict, Ethan stood on a stage in front of thousands at a rally for corporate accountability. The crowd was a sea of faces, united by a shared belief in justice and equality. Ethan took a deep breath and spoke the words that had driven him from the beginning. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but together we can make sure the future looks different. We can build a world where fairness isn't optional, where justice isn't a privilege, but a right." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt the weight of his journey lift, replaced by a sense of purpose that would carry him forward.